Welcome to part 2 of this lecture on Shakespeare Sonnets for English 340, Survey of English Literature. Now that we've discussed the background of these sonnets, when they were written, possibly why they were written, possibly for whom they've written, as far as we know, let's look at the sonnets themselves. The first one we're going to look at was not one that was assigned in your reading, but is worth investigating for how it sets up the weird way that it turns. As I mentioned, Greenblatt and others have this theory that Shakespeare was commissioned to write these sonnets by people who knew that Wriothesley was somehow attached to or admired Shakespeare, and were using the older man who had the respect of the young and feckless Earl to convince him not to waste his fortune and his life frittering away all his time in London in the theater, but get about the important business of an aristocrat, which is to make an heir. And so Shakespeare, knowing the temperament perhaps of Wriothesley as somebody who was maybe really into how pretty he was, tells Wriothesley that he's so pretty that he has a duty to reproduce. And he writes to him in Sonnet 3, "Look in thy glass," that is your mirror, "look in thy glass until the face thou viewest. Now is the time that face should form another, whose fresh repair, if now thou not renewest, thou dost beguile the world, unbless some mother. For where is she so fair whose uneared womb disdains the tillage of thy husbandry? Or who is he so fond will be the tomb of his self-love to stop posterity? Thou art thy mother's glass, and she in thee calls back the lovely April of her prime. So thou through windows of thine age shalt see, despite of wrinkles, this thy golden time. But if thou live, remembered not to be, die single, and thine image dies with thee." Now, the first 17 sonnets, as I said, are on this theme, this idea that you're so beautiful that you really should reproduce yourself. The face should form another. The whose fresh repair, if now that thou not renewest, thou dost beguile the world, unbless some mother. Some woman is just waiting for you who would be just blessed to have you ear her womb. That uneared is an agricultural term that goes along with tillage, suggesting the woman as a field to be plowed and sown. Nice, eh? So, but no, also, you are as lovely as your mother, and she in thee calls back the lovely April of her prime, and so you are going to live on. Your image is going to live on by reproducing itself. And this is a frankly bizarre theme for a sonnet, probably unprecedented before Shakespeare. And it's so bizarre that this is what gives rise to the theories that he was put up to writing these when he was hard up for cash. But the emphasis changes, right? After 17 sonnets all saying, "Hey, young pretty guy, get married and do your duty," he then says this to this guy. He is pretty, isn't he? Look at those lovely hands. He says, "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?" You've heard this before, right? "Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Sometimes too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed, and every fair from fair some time declines, by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest. Nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee." Now, it seems at first that Shakespeare is going to pursue the theme that he has been pursuing, right? You're so lovely, you should reproduce. But it starts to change here. Every fair from fair sometimes declines. That is, The fair being that is reproduced from another fair being also declines and dies. Everything is subject to nature's changing course. All biological life dies, but thy eternal slumber shall not fade, right? Nor lose possession of that fair thou owest, that which you own. Nor shall death brag thou wanderest in the shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. But now we're not talking about the lines of succession. We're not talking about the lines of genealogy, but the lines of poetry. When in eternal lines to time thou growest, so long as men can breathe, their eyes can see, so long lives this poem, and this gives life to thee. And this is a more traditional theme of humanistic poetry, the idea that poetry is, as Horace and later Dante put it, a monument more lasting than bronze in a mouthful of broken air. And Shakespeare will develop this idea for a number of sonnets of that this young man reproduces his beauty through the poet's mediation, through the poet's writing of his beauty in these lines. But then it also charts sort of changing love affair and different sort of conditions. The poet turns his interest on himself in Sonnet 29. When in disgrace with fortune in men's eyes, I all alone beweep my outcast state, and trouble deaf heaven with my bootless cries, and look upon myself and curse my fate. Wishing me like to one more rich in hope, featured like him with friends possessed, desiring this man's art and that man's scope, with what I most enjoy, contented least. Yet in these thoughts myself almost despising, haply I think on thee, and then my state, like to the lark at break of day arising, from sullen earth sings hymns at heaven's gate, for thy sweet love remembered such wealth brings, that then I scorn to change my state with kings. Here, love is used to reflect or to articulate the poet's own unhappiness or discontentment, right? He talks about being disgraced, outcast. His cries to heaven are bootless or useless, and he looks upon himself and curses his fate and compares himself to other people, wishing himself richer, better looking, being more popular, being more talented, hilariously for Shakespeare, having a wider view or range of the world. And I love this, with what I most enjoy, contented least. Great description of discontent. Here it turns, after the second quatrain. Yet in these thoughts myself almost despising, haply I think on thee, and then my state, like to the lark at break of day arising from sullen earth, sings hymns at heaven's gate. What a wonderful articulation of joy that loves bring. And then he doesn't want to change his state with kings. So he claims to be happy, but at the same time, it does mark a difference in class, in opportunity, in social circumstances between the poet and the addressee. And that difference is a problem that pops its head up through various sonnets. The next sonnet I want to look at is one of my favorites by Shakespeare, and it meditates on the difference in age between the beloved and the poet. He writes, "That time of year thou mayest in me behold, when yellow leaves, or none, or few do hang upon these boughs which shake against the cold. Bare, ruined choirs, where late the sweet birds sang. In me thou seest the twilight of such day as after sunset fadeth in the west, which by and by black night doth take away, death's second self, that seals up all in rest. In me thou seest the glowing of such fire that on the ashes of his youth doth lie, as the deathbed whereon it must expire, consumed with that which it was nourished by. This thou perceivest, which makes thy love more strong, to love that well which thou must leave ere long." This poem develops its theme of, I guess we might say, a May-December romance, even though Shakespeare is really only in his around 30 when he writes it. It develops this theme through a succession of metaphors. First, there's that time of year, right? And what time of year it is? Yellow leaves, or none or few, hang upon those boughs which shake against the cold. And so he's describing his own age as being autumn, right? As being faded, past his summer. And then he puts a metaphor within the metaphor, describing the bare boughs which shake against the cold as bare ruined choirs. Now, this is an image that for Shakespeare, in Shakespeare's day, would have evoked the monasteries of England, which had been closed, abandoned, despoiled, and pillaged in the time of the English Reformation in 1538 by Henry VIII. And walking around the English countryside, you could still see these grand monasteries that had once been full of monks. And he uses these as this is a metaphorical description of the bare branches where birds sing. So much imagery condensed into these first four lines. And then there's a second metaphor, twilight. In me thou seest the twilight of such day as after sunset fadeth in the west, which by and by black night doth take away. So he's not the black night yet, but he's the twilight. He's the fading light. And then makes a transition then, which by and by night doth take away, death's second self that seals up all in rest. Now, death's second self that comes at night could be equated to sleep, but death in the Renaissance, and especially in the erotic discourse of love poetry, is always associated with, almost always associated with orgasm, with sex. And this sets us up for the transition in the next part. In me thou seest the glowing of such fire that on the ashes of his youth doth lie, as the deathbed whereon it must expire, consumed with that which it was nourished by. Now, we might talk about the fire as burning down and glowing on the ashes of his youth. That is the sort of, imagine when you go camping and there's a hot young fire, and it's flickering and it's huge, and then as it gets lower and lower, the coals start glowing hotter and hotter, right? And so we can talk about the fire lying on the ashes of its youth, but then there's a little bit of ambiguity about lying on his youth there and being on the deathbed where it must expire. And this is another word that we can associate with death, the sudden expiration or release of breath that might come if he is, lying on his youth. I'll let you connect the dots here. Consumed with that which it was nourished by. And this, of course, speaks to the idea that in Renaissance physiology, that every orgasm used up a little bit of your life force and shortened your life by a few minutes. So there's a lot of sexiness in this poem, and it is a poem not just meditating on death, but is, as the final couplet makes really clear, a poem of seduction. You see all this. You know who I am. You can see me fading. You can see my coals glowing hotter, etc., which makes thy love more strong to love that well, which thou must leave ere long. And, this might speak to a fading of their relationship, the expiration of the passion, because, honestly, to speak about him, dying soon and being in the twilight of his years when he's in his early 30s is a little melodramatic, I think.